Subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. And without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. With the hybrid format of this hearing, we have some members and witnesses participating in person and others on the WebEx platform. And for those of you on the WebEx platform, we've had some trouble with the timer. And so I will have to step in if people are running over their time limits or something like that, but we should be fine. I would like to remind all members participating remotely to keep themselves muted. When they are not recognized, the staff has been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not recognized and there is inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may only participate in one remote proceeding at a time. And if you are participating remotely today, please keep your camera on. And if you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. This hearing is entitled Cyber Threats, Consumer Data, and the Financial System. Legislation noticed with today's hearing includes H.R. 3910, the Safeguarding Non-Bank Consumer Information Act, a discussion draft entitled the Strengthening Cybersecurity for the Financial Sector Act, and a discussion draft entitled the Enhancing Cybersecurity of Nationwide Consumer Reporting Agencies Act. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. In both business and medicine, they have variations of what's known as the Sutton Rule. And for those of you that don't know what the Sutton Rule is, it's based on an old urban legend about a famous bank robber named Willie Sutton. When he was asked by a reporter why he robbed banks, Sutton casually replied, "Because that's where the money is." The Sutton Rule suggests going after the obvious target. Banks and credit unions have long been targets for criminals, but today's criminals don't wield Tommy guns, and they aren't only after cash. Cybercriminals also target financial institutions to steal consumer and business data, deploy ransomware, and disrupt services. Ransomware attacks have been growing in frequency and severity for years. Over the first half of this year, there was a 1,318% increase in ransomware attacks on banks and credit unions. Consumer financial and personal data is an attractive target for criminals. I doubt there is a person in this committee who has not had some of their personal or financial information exposed in a data breach, and I know I've been impacted by multiple data breaches over the last few years. Tech companies, financial institutions, and many other businesses are collecting and storing more consumer data than ever before. The 2017 Equifax breach exposed the data of 147 million people, including 200,000 credit card numbers. And in 2019, Capital One was hacked and 100 million credit card applications were stolen. The issues of cybersecurity and consumer data rights are intertwined. This makes cybersecurity critical for all financial institutions, large and small. And earlier this year, the CEOs of the largest banks in the United States testified before our committee. Congressman Huizenga asked them what was the greatest threat facing our financial system is, or what was one of them, and the answers from 4 of the 6 CEOs included cybersecurity. Similarly, in a recent survey, 71% of community bankers listed cybersecurity as a significant risk. Many financial institutions have strong cybersecurity protections, but such efforts don't come cheap. For some of the largest banks, cyber defenses cost more than $1 billion per year. In May of this year, President Biden issued an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity to enhance information sharing between the government and the private sector, modernize cybersecurity standards in government, improve software supply chain security, and make other improvements to cyber defenses. Additionally, the Treasury Department recently announced new efforts to counter the rise in ransomware, including sanctions against a cryptocurrency exchange for facilitating ransomware payments. The security and resilience of our financial system is not a partisan issue. Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated voters all share the desire to stop criminals from exploiting vulnerabilities and carrying out attacks on critical infrastructure such as financial institutions. I was pleased to work with my friend from Missouri, Ranking Member Luetkemeyer, on this hearing, and I appreciate his ideas and commitment to strengthening cyber defenses in the financial sector, and I appreciate working with my friend Representative Kustoff on this very same subject. I look forward to this discussion today to learn how we can better work together to improve cybersecurity in the financial sector to protect businesses and consumers. And with that, I will now yield to the vice-ranking member of our committee, Mr. Kustoff, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening today's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today in person and virtually. Without a doubt, our financial system is the envy of the world. I think we all agree with that. To make sure it stays that way, Republicans need to continue to embrace technology and support innovation. We do. In fact, both sides of the aisle do. Private sector innovation has led us to more dynamic and inclusive financial institutions that are better equipped to serve American consumers. But bad actors continue to evolve. We've seen cyber espionage from foreign adversaries, such as China and Russia and Iran, and they've all spiked. And that's why it's crucial that we remain one step ahead. Cyber attacks pose one of the greatest threats to our financial systems. And understanding what policies will better protect our financial institutions and consumers, it remains a top priority for this committee. Again, both sides of the aisle. As we've seen, there are vulnerabilities in the system, and they've got to be identified and they've got to be corrected. We know that financial institutions have been one of the leading targets for cyber criminals. Just recently, we witnessed the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. Attacks of this size, they're more common than they ever have been before. And with that, financial institutions, they're more mindful that a similar attack could happen to them. We all know that such an attack could disrupt the flow of money to consumers, disclose closely held personal information, and ultimately undermine confidence in the entire banking system. So again, I do want to thank the witnesses for being here today. They face the daily challenges of cybersecurity, and I think will provide us today with a real-world perspective. This committee has already begun work on these important issues. We included bipartisan cybersecurity provisions in legislations just last year, and financial regulators are providing Congress more information about cybersecurity risks. In January of this year, Republicans issued a report which found the COVID-19 pandemic and related relief programs created an environment ripe for cyber criminal activity. Now, this continues to threaten our financial system and American consumers today. As our economy recovers, protecting our financial system from cyber criminals assumes an even more important role. And we all know that technology is changing the way consumers and investors operate. Online commerce is becoming the norm, and people are working from home more than ever before. Cyber exposure continues to grow. More work can and certainly must be done. Private sector innovation, not government mandates, can lead the way. One-size-fits-all government policies, they won't be the solution. So with that, I do want to thank the chairman. I also want to thank Ranking Member Luetkemeyer for convening this hearing, which I think will be both informative and helpful. And I look forward to more bipartisan work on this issue. And Mr. Chairman, before I yield back my time, I would ask unanimous consent to insert the ranking member's remarks into the record.
Without objection.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now the chair would like to recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for a minute for her remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair Perlmutter, for holding this important hearing on cybersecurity. Financial institutions have long been a top target for cyber criminals. Several years ago, Equifax experienced one of the largest cyber attacks, exposing the sensitive and personal identifiable information of nearly 150 million Americans. Government agencies and institutions are observing an alarming increase in the volume and sophistication of cyber attacks. According to one report, banks and credit unions experienced a 1,318% increase in ransomware attacks during the first part of this year. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on ways we can strengthen cybersecurity in the financial sector, including understanding how small institutions like minority depository institutions utilize third-party vendors to provide core processing and software, and what vulnerabilities arising from those partnerships we need to address. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. And so now it's my pleasure to welcome each of our witnesses, and I want to introduce our panel. We'll begin with Samir Jain, who is present in the hearing room today. He is the Director of Policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Mr. Jain has decades of experience in private practice and government, including the Department of Justice, and as a Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy for the National Security Council. We have Mr. Robert James II, who is the President and CEO of Carver Financial Corporation. Mr. James is also Director of Strategic Initiatives at Carver State Bank and currently serves as the Chairman of the National Bankers Association. We have from my great state of Colorado, Carlos Vazquez. He is the Chief Information Security Officer of Canvas Credit Union in Colorado. Mr. Vazquez has decades of experience in information technology and security and currently leads Canvas Credit Union's efforts in mitigating cybersecurity risks. Finally, our fourth witness is Jeff Newgard, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Bank of Idaho. He is testifying on behalf of the Independent Community Bankers of America, and previously Mr. Newgard was President and CEO of Yakima National Bank, and he is a graduate of the Colorado Graduate School of Banking. Witnesses are reminded your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. I think our timer is now working. You should be able to see a timer on the desk in front of you or on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I'd ask you to be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up your testimony so we can be respectful of both the other witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. I'd also ask, just as a personal plea, to take your time with your testimony, speak as clearly as you can, because especially if you're on the platform, your testimony kind of reverberates in this room. So for these ears, I just would appreciate that as part of this. So I'd like to now recognize Mr. Jain. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony, sir.
Thank you and good morning. CDT is a nonpartisan nonprofit 501c3 organization dedicated to advancing civil rights and civil liberties in the digital world. On behalf of CDT, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. In my written statement, I discussed how the cyber threat environment has grown more dangerous. Two of you, I think this morning, have already noted the statistic about a 1,318% increase in ransomware attacks in the last year. Today, I'm going to briefly discuss a few of the challenges that the financial services sector in particular faces in addressing cyber threats, and two potential areas in which we can make progress to better protect consumers and their data. Even though the financial services industry has responded more proactively to cybersecurity challenges than most sectors, it still remains highly vulnerable. I'll focus on three particular reasons why. First, financial institutions are highly interconnected with one another and with third-party service providers, which has significant implications from a systemic perspective. A cyber attack can spread rapidly across the financial sector as an attacker moves laterally across institutions between financial networks. Moreover, if many financial institutions rely on a common vendor, a successful attack on that single vendor can have sector-wide consequences. A second challenge is the gap between large and small financial institutions. The largest financial institutions have significant in-house cyber expertise and can develop or purchase sophisticated defensive products. But smaller financial institutions don't have those resources or capabilities. But they aren't immune from attack just because they're small. In 2020, over a quarter of breaches involved small businesses. A third challenge is the increasing reliance on technology. Today, customers interact with the financial system through networks, even for traditional banking services. As a result, the financial sector is increasingly subject to disruption from cyber attacks. And that is all the more true once you look beyond traditional banks to the role of fintech, data aggregators, and large technology platforms. Now, in the face of these challenges, both the government and the private sector have sought to address cyber threats for a number of years, but much work remains to be done. I'll highlight two areas in particular. First, information sharing. Information sharing remains a fundamental component of any successful cybersecurity strategy, but we've learned that effective information sharing is hard. The most useful information is actionable. It can actually be used by network defenders to prevent or recover from a cyber incident. It also needs to be as close to real time as possible so that they can act on time. And information sharing needs to separate signal from noise. Otherwise, companies may not know what information they should pay attention to now and what they can safely ignore or leave for later. One step Congress should consider in connection with information sharing is mandating that critical infrastructure entities report cyber incidents to the federal government. Today, no government agency has a complete picture of what institutions have suffered cyber incidents, and such information could clearly be valuable in bolstering cyber defenses. A second area to which Congress should look is baseline privacy legislation. Instead of one comprehensive set of rules to protect personal data throughout the digital ecosystem, we have a patchwork of sectoral laws with varying protections. One such law, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, applies to financial institutions. However, GLBA is inadequate to protect consumer financial data for at least two reasons. First, it applies only to financial institutions, a defined term that does not capture the full range of fintech and other technology companies and data aggregators that today process consumer financial information. Second, GLBA is limited in its privacy protections. It focuses on providing notice to consumers of certain forms of data sharing and permits them to opt out. Yet we all know that consumers don't read or rarely read online privacy policies, and that notice and consent therefore rests on a fiction. GLBA effectively adopts a broad default sharing of consumer financial information. The time has come for Congress to enact comprehensive privacy legislation that shifts the burden away from consumers and imposes obligations on the entities that collect, use, and share data. Privacy legislation should, among other things, require an entity to minimize the data it collects and processes based on the purpose for which the entity needs the data. It should prohibit the secondary use or sharing of sensitive data without the express opt-in consent of the consumer, and it should include data security requirements. Each of these steps will lower the risk to consumers from cyber attacks by reducing the amount of data that will be collected and shared and ensuring that whatever data is collected is handled with appropriate care. Moreover, a common privacy baseline that applies to all companies will avoid the situation we have today in which the same data may receive some protection if processed by one entity, but less protection if processed by another. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. Appreciate your testimony. Now, we'd like to recognize Mr. James. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Perlmutter, Ranking Member Luetkemeyer, Vice Ranking Member Kustoff, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee. We appreciate this opportunity to testify this morning on cyber threats, consumer data, and the financial system. My name is Robert James II, and I am president of Carver Financial Corporation, the holding company for Carver State Bank in Savannah, Georgia, and I'm also privileged to serve as chairman of the National Bankers Association. The NBA is the leading trade association for minority depository institutions. Our mission is to advocate for MDIs on all legislative and regulatory matters concerning and affecting our members and the communities we serve. Our members are on the front lines of reducing economic hardship in minority communities, which are underserved by traditional banks and have been hardest hit by the pandemic. MDIs are critical economic development engines in minority and low-income communities, particularly due to our trusted relationships in these communities. Our internal teams work tirelessly to protect our systems and our customers from ever-evolving cyber threats. We take these threats extremely seriously. Unfortunately, our small scale and lack of access to cutting-edge technology does not always allow us to move with the speed or agility required in times like these. A critical component of the resilience of the banking sector and its ability to assist underserved communities is the ability to adapt technologically. A host of different factors are intersecting to change the banking industry. Like most community banks, MDIs are heavily reliant on a handful of large technology companies that provide core processing services or the technological systems of our operations. These companies have no incentives to help us adapt to the changing competitive landscape. We are consigned to long-term contracts with punitive early termination provisions, cannot easily plug in modern outside solutions that make it easier for our customers to do business or secure their data. And the fundamental technology of many of these systems is antiquated and leaves us incapable of making rapid changes. Because we're often the smallest clients of these giant firms, we receive the lowest priority for service. Our bank employees are constantly training and monitoring our internal systems, but we do not get the latest and best technology from the big core processors. We saw this play out during each round of the Paycheck Protection Program. Congress devised the program as a mechanism to aid small businesses who suddenly found themselves forced to close during stay-at-home orders. A set of conditions favored larger businesses and disadvantaged our banks in our communities. Many banks only approved loans for existing customers, delayed the applications of sole proprietorships, and didn't allow enough time for institutions like ours to work with small businesses through the application process. This combined to shut out many minority-owned businesses. Our banks found themselves sorely lacking in the technology needed to quickly respond. Unregulated companies were able to build technology solutions to address this market, but our banks, reliant on the core processors, were stuck with outdated processes that limited our ability to serve our customers. We also need our regulatory partners to help. We need to invest more in technology and the right people to implement it, but these investments can result in criticism when our earnings don't meet regulatory expectations. We can also find ourselves in situations where local or regional examiners impede our ability to implement new technological solutions. Several recent industry reports have attempted to detail how banks are responding to the challenge, whether through investment, data management, or new strategies to engage with customers. But with every step, there are obstacles, including potential workforce impact or just the burden of increased cost of technology investments. Even as customers primarily conduct transactions over mobile, banks are discovering that they still expect branch service to be an option. Young consumers are also open to going to technology firms for all of their financial services. In a recent global survey, Accenture found that 31% of bank customers would consider Google, Amazon, or Facebook if they offer such services. According to an FIS survey, the top 20% of firms are changing policy to promote and emphasize digital innovation. These firms are recruiting for digital technology expertise, encouraging more open innovation across roles, and appointing board-level roles with responsibility for digital innovation. It is difficult for our small banks to keep up. In conclusion, cultural shifts inside the financial services industry, including the core processors and the regulators, are necessary to help MDIs and other community banks better orient ourselves to meet new customer demands. Even though our teams are keeping our bank-side systems very safe, we are heavily reliant on the big three core processors. Because of this concentration, our institutions are saddled with complex, onerous long-term contracts that stifle innovation in all areas, including security and identity verification. As the smallest banks, we get the worst service and are last to get innovations. So our banks have a hard time competing with large banks and cannot easily offer our customers the latest technology. Our regulators do not always allow us to make needed investments in technology because of pressure on earnings. These factors can combine to leave our customers and communities frustrated and vulnerable. We look forward to working closely with the committee and subcommittee on ways we can level the playing field and ensure that our customers have access to the latest, most secure technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. James. Appreciate your testimony. Mr. Vazquez, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. 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 Chairman. Than Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to your subcommittee to discuss cybersecurity. We were provided with a few topics we'll be discussing, so I'd like to speak to these. The National Credit Union Administration is seeking legislative authority to have oversight over credit union or service organizations and third-party vendors that offer services to credit unions. The NCUA sits on the Financial Security Oversight Council, yet is the only federal agency that currently does not have this statutory authority as it relates to vendors that serve banking organizations. We believe credit unions deserve a federal regulator with parity in this regard. Canvas Credit Union is supportive of parity for NCUA if the NCUA shares its information with state regulators and coordinates efforts with them whenever possible. It is important that vendors who have access to our members' data are held to the same standards as credit unions. It is the responsibility of Canvas to ensure our members' financial data is safe and secure. We expect no less from our vendors. An additional level of comfort would be possible knowing that our vendors would also be scrutinized by a regulatory agency complementing our own vendor due diligence programs. On the efforts by government agencies to strengthen cybersecurity defenses, data sharing is paramount in ensuring credit union security departments are up to date on all the threats affecting the security landscape. CISA, Homeland Security, and Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center are all doing a great job in disseminating threat information in a timely manner. Security webinars, conferences, summits all provide important security information that allows for credit unions to remain current with the constant evolving threat landscape. In several recent summits, there was participation by CISA and Homeland Security as either guest speakers or presenters. Having these agencies present at these gatherings is very helpful and important as the discussions presented provide vital information as well as reassurance that our government is standing with financial institutions in their battle against the malicious actors. One service I'd like to highlight is the automated network scanning tool provided by CISA. This free tool complements our tool chest for security systems that monitor and test our network. For Canvas, it's another tool to use, but for smaller credit unions, it could be the only tool they have. I would like to see more efforts placed on providing free services to help credit unions with their security frameworks. Canvas Credit Union follows the NIST cybersecurity framework, as do many financial institutions. We are thankful for the guidance NIST provides on many architectures such as zero trust and identity management. These guidelines definitely help credit unions in their roles of ensuring our members' data remains secure. FSISAC is a resource that provides collaboration tools and security education to member financial institutions. They do a fantastic job ensuring that those that need the help get the help they need. On consumer data protection challenges, people and technology are the challenges credit unions face to ensure our members' data is protected. Statistics show that massive shortage exists in skilled security professionals, which are required to manage the sophisticated tools in use today. Many in the security industry are working to address this shortage by providing access to security training at all educational levels. We would expect our government would also be focused on addressing this skills shortage. Technology will constantly be changing and improving to counter the threat landscape brought to us by the hackers bent on breaking into our networks to steal our data for their financial gain. Security teams are constantly on the defensive when it comes to protecting our networks. Security tools are improving, allowing for better detection to address vulnerabilities, but a focus by software vendors on security at the early stage of the development life cycle would ensure most of these vulnerabilities are caught prior to going live with their product. Vendors need to have a better focus on security of both software development and how they store our data on their systems. As mentioned before, vendors should be held to the same standard credit unions are when it comes to protecting our members' data. In closing, cybersecurity will always be in a state of change. Yesterday, the threat was malware, viruses, malicious executables inserted into our company's network. Today, as you've mentioned, ransomware, social engineering, supply chain attacks are all the threats of today. Tomorrow, we'll see the same, plus deepfake technology, yet unknown vulnerabilities in current hardware and software deployed by companies. Quantum processing, which may be allows for easy compromise of all of our current cipher technology, is an added concern as well. I would like to thank the subcommittee for bringing a focus on cybersecurity, the challenges it presents, and the role all of us have in protecting our data. It is an honor and privilege to speak with you today representing Canvas Credit Union.
Thank you, Mr. Vazquez. Appreciate your testimony. Now, our final witness, Mr. Newgard, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Perlmutter, Ranking Member Luetkemeyer, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Jeff Newgard, President and CEO of Bank of Idaho, a $700 million asset community bank headquartered in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and serving markets throughout the state. I testify today on behalf of the Independent Community Bankers of America, where I am chair of the Cyber and Data Security Committee. A community bank that does not successfully navigate cyber threats and safeguard its customers will lose their trust and cannot remain viable and independent. To enhance cybersecurity, we need support from policymakers in Congress, the administration, and the agencies. Community banks need to be on the cutting edge of technology to remain relevant and to compete with larger institutions as well as newer fintechs. But we need to adopt technology in a way that protects our vulnerable customers and the financial system as a whole. We operate in an ecosystem that includes all financial institutions, as well as retailers, core providers, and many others. We're all in this together. An attack on any one node of the ecosystem is an attack on all participants. Cyber threats have evolved in recent years from criminal attackers seeking profit to nation states with massive resources and technological sophistication. The threats are greater than ever and continue to mount and evolve. How do we manage the complexity? 10 years ago, community bank technology was mostly provided in-house. Today, this is simply an unaffordable option. Disaster recovery mandates, as well as new technologies such as internet banking, mobile banking, and imaging, have escalated the cost of cybersecurity. In response, community banks have turned to core providers and other large third-party providers for their cybersecurity. At the same time, consolidation has occurred among the core providers. Today, just 3 or 4 providers dominate the market. This has increased their market power and leverage, and most importantly, it has put a target on their backs. Their connections to other institutions and servicers create a web of vulnerability. What do we need from policymakers? While I provide more detail in my written statement, our recommendations form 3 broad themes. First, close the gaps in law, standards, and examination. Second, create greater uniformity and harmonization of regulatory efforts. And third, promote sharing of information and best practices across the ecosystem. The gaps in today's regulatory environment exist because not all parties that process and store sensitive information are subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which requires safeguarding of sensitive data backed by examination to ensure compliance. Retailers and technology companies, for example, are not subject to GLBA. Core providers and other third-party providers, as well as credit reporting agencies, are not subject to examination. A gap in accountability also contributes to systemic failures. When a data breach occurs, we believe that liability for that breach should be assigned to incentivize stronger security. The costs of a breach should be borne by the party that incurs the breach, be that a retailer, a credit reporting agency, bank, or credit union. Too often, the breached entity evades accountability while financial institutions are left to mitigate damages to their customers. Uniformity and harmonization will strengthen the ecosystem by eliminating redundancy, closing gaps, and strengthening weak links. Financial institutions are regulated, overseen, and examined by 4 agencies, which unfortunately do not adequately coordinate their data security efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My written statement provides comment on legislation before the committee today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newgard. I'd now like to recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Perlmutter, I'd like to thank you again so much for this hearing today. And I want to thank you for the way that you have provided leadership on bipartisanship to deal with a serious issue confronting this country and this world. I want to thank the witnesses who are here today, and I want to thank particularly Mr. James and of course, Mr. Newgard, that we've heard from today. And I'm so very interested in all that we have learned about these core processors and the lack of competition, and of course, the cost to our smaller institutions, our MDIs, our CDFIs, and our community banks. And so I would just like to ask Mr. James whether or not you agree with Mr. Newgard. He not only gave us a very vivid description of what is going on, but he talked about recommendations, which I was very pleased to hear about. Do you agree with the recommendations that Mr. Newgard just shared with us and is giving us more information about?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chairwoman. Yes, I actually agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Newgard. As you stated, all of our community banks are really subject to the whims of a handful of very large companies. And while we are, in a sense, secure, additionally secure, because there's ways for us to cut off access to consumer information at our bank locations, and our staff, at Carver State Bank, I'm sure Jeff's staff at the Bank of Idaho work tirelessly, train constantly, keeping up with various threats and landscape. We are very dependent on these big core processors, and they have almost no incentives to work with our banks and make sure that we have the latest and greatest technology. So, I surmise that we're not necessarily getting the same level of service and attention that some of the larger institutions are getting, because we don't get the same level of service and attention when it comes to the customer-facing technology. And so, I do know that the big core processors are attempting to keep their systems very safe, but they present a significant amount of risk to the entire system. And so I think that they need to be subject to some of this, subject to examination. And I certainly agree with Mr. Newgard's recommendations.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, just in this short period of time, I've heard enough from our witnesses today that leads me to believe that we must step up our action to deal with cybersecurity, and particularly with our community banks, our CDFIs, and our MDIs, who are at the mercy of core processors who certainly attempt to do a good job, but I get the feeling that our smaller institutions are at the mercy of the work that is done for the larger institutions. And the other thing that I'd like to say to my colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle, I can't think of a better subject or a project that we could work on together than cybersecurity. And I want you to know that I would join with you for whatever it costs for us to ensure that they're able to deal with the sophisticated cybersecurity that they need. And so we really have to speed this up. We cannot linger as we deal with this and then be forced to have to deal with the fact that there's been a big breach, another big breach. We've got to stop them, and we've got to do it now. So this is very important. I appreciate working with the opposite side of the aisle. I don't always, but I do now. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to work together. Let's get busy. Let's do it quickly. And let's make sure that our smaller institutions have the resources that they need to do the job. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the chair. She yields back, and I appreciate the comments about this is a subject all of us need to tackle together. And with that, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, our ranking member, Mr. Luetkemeyer, for his questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and in the spirit of bipartisanship here that the chairwoman has set, before I begin my questioning, I want to take a moment to thank you for working with me in a bipartisan manner to hold this hearing today. I know we sat down and discussed the various topics to be able to find some common ground on, and this is one of them, and we were able to sit down and pick the subject as well as the witnesses. I appreciate your willingness to work across the aisle, and I'm sure nothing last night had any sort of impact on what we're doing today. But along these lines, Mr. Newgard, you mentioned a minute ago something about some of these different entities that could enable the bad guys, so to speak, to access your records, and then the retailers or whoever escape liability for allowing the folks to access your records, the documents, the data. Would you like to expound on it just a little bit and explain how that happens and what the reaction is and the costs that are associated with it?
Sure. Financial institutions are subject to examination. We're subject to GLBA. That does not go across the entire ecosystem. That is the issue. Retailers, the core processors, they're not subject to examination. And what happens in the real world is when customers get their information breached, and say, for example, a debit card is compromised, we work very hard to get that account closed and reissued. There's very little incentive from the retailer or from the entity that was breached to help out in that process because they don't bear any of the cost. In fact, many times the consumer does not bear the cost. The bank or the financial institution has to bear that cost. And so there's very little incentive to work together and to strengthen the entire system. And that's the important thing. It is an ecosystem.
So how do you resolve that situation? What's your suggestion on how you fix that?
So the cost.
Do the courts need to step in here? Do the courts need to step in and assign blame, assign liability? Do we need to have contracts that somehow explain where the liability lies for certain actions when they're taken? How do you fix this?
Yes. So the retailers, the entities that are breached need to bear the cost. So they need to be responsible for that breach. There's such a numbness within the world, within the consumer world. You hear about breaches all the time, and people are numb to it. There's no accountability, so there needs to be a cost associated with having a breach. Instead of just assigning, they get out of it. Basically, they sidestep it, and we are held accountable. In many cases, financial institutions have to pay for it, and the consumer is numb to it. So that there's been cases where I try to reissue the debit card, and the consumer really likes the convenience and doesn't want to change cards. They'd rather have the convenience of using their card.
Very good, thank you. I've got limited amount of time. I want to move on here. Mr. James, I appreciate you being in front of us again. I always enjoy your comments. Thank you for being here. I know the chairwoman made a comment ago about the smallest banks being vulnerable, and I know you represent a lot of small banks, and so I was curious as to, the concern I have is that, the big banks seem like they've got unlimited resources to be able to do whatever it takes to protect themselves, and the small banks are really vulnerable from the standpoint that they can only purchase the amount of protection they can afford. How vulnerable does that leave them?
So thank you, Ranking Member Luetkemeyer. It does leave us vulnerable. I walked through our bank's cybersecurity program with our Chief Technology Officer on yesterday. And what he explained to me is that, we constantly train, we constantly test our employees, we constantly test our own systems that are sort of on the bank side. And because of the fact that we're plugged into these cores, we can cut off attacks at the local level and kind of minimize the damage. The flip side is that it's very challenging if the core processor gets attacked. That could shut down our ability to provide our customers with access to their funds, that could shut down our ability to, transact business for them. And so that's really where the challenge comes in, is because
Okay,
of
so
the
what you're,
vulnerability of these
so what you're
core
saying is the big
processors.
guys can afford their own core processor, while the small guys are at the mercy of the core processors, whoever they may be, that services their needs. So we thank you for that. I apologize, but I'm
exactly
out of
right.
time. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. And Mr. Newgard, I was chuckling about your anecdote about the guy who didn't want to change his credit card because it was inconvenient. I recently had Wells Fargo notified me of some unauthorized charges, one in Ohio, one in South Carolina. I said, okay, I'll close my credit card and get a new one. And then I realized all the different accounts that were attached to automatic payments on that credit card. Usually when they turned off my TV, or, I didn't pay for the Terminex, the pest guys. So I can understand your customers saying they didn't want to change their cards because all of a sudden it really is inconvenient. So we got to do our best to stop this at the beginning. But I did appreciate my bank notifying me of these unauthorized charges. So Mr. Vazquez, I have a question for you. In your testimony, you call for the National Credit Union Administration to have parity with other financial regulators regarding oversight of third-party vendors. What are some of the challenges credit unions face in vendor management, and how might expanding this authority benefit credit unions such as yours?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. The credit unions, as others have mentioned, there, you have small credit unions, you have large credit unions, and the larger credit unions can have a very robust vendor management program, while the smaller ones cannot. And it takes a huge program to be able to look at the vendor, review their contracts, look at their SOC, and look at their security landscape to ensure that they have the security that we have to match. So what we're looking for is to say that we are being regulated to ensure that we're doing right by our members to hold their data safe and secure. The vendors that have our data that we contract with to better serve and provide services to our members, they now have our data, but they need to have the same security stance that we have. They need to have the same care that we have. So without that type of regulation, we don't have that comfort, especially smaller credit unions, to know that we're all on the same level field in protecting our data.
All right, thank you. Mr. Jain, this question may be better for the Science Committee, but I'm hoping that you might have, or any of the panelists. Somebody mentioned quantum computing and the potential benefits or concerns that something like that might have. In your studies, because you've had a pretty broad background, have you begun thinking about what quantum computing might do to enhance security or harm security?
Thank you for that question. I think when we think about a lot of these new technological developments, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's the increased use of artificial intelligence, I think the difficulty is it can both help attackers and defenders, right? Because attackers can use these technologies, whether it's to try to overcome encryption or to automate their attacks and do them faster. On the other hand, defenders also potentially could take advantage of these technologies to help automate their defenses. Although this is an area where I think this disconnect that we've been talking about between large banks and large institutions and small institutions, again, will come into play, because it's going to be the large banks that can afford to try to take advantage and deploy some of these newer technologies. Going to be much harder for the smaller institutions and banks. And so I think this is just going to exacerbate the sort of divide that we're seeing between the large and the small.
Thanks. Mr. James, as we saw in the SolarWinds hack and other cyber attacks, criminals are increasingly attempting to breach service providers. And for minority depository institutions and community banks, if one of the core service providers was compromised, how many financial institutions might be affected, if you can give us a guess?
Sure. So, Mr. Luetkemeyer, I'm sorry, Chairman Perlmutter, One of the beauties of the American financial system is the diversity of financial institutions and community-oriented financial institutions that we have to serve customers and create those relationships. Our institutions really need to be able to, protect our customers. There's probably, on the banking side alone, there's probably 4,000 or so banks that would be, vulnerable in the event of attacks on the big core processors. And so, that's probably 80% of the banks that are regulated, that are insured by the FDIC. That's my
Thank you,
guess.
sir. My time has expired. I'd now like to recognize my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Newgard, could you discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated cybersecurity threats and what challenges your bank and others have seen as a result of the lost year, so to speak, which continues?
Well, the biggest challenge is the mobility of the workforce. Everybody, as was mentioned previously, went home and worked from home. That has created vulnerability, and as people have relied on working remotely. So that's been a big challenge as people have adapted, and criminals take advantage of that and use that as an opportunity to create fraud, and there's incentive to do that.
Well, along that line, I guess I have to ask, is there anything that the government can do to help institutions address this kind of an issue? Is there additional flexibility, or just is there any way to help you cope with that?
Yes, there's several. One of which is we talked about core providers. We are at the whim of core providers in that it's very expensive. These contracts are expensive and they're long-term. So if we go in, say, 2 or 3 years into a contract and determine that this is the wrong course of action for us, that there may be a better provider, it's very expensive to exit out of that. If an examiner comes in and wants to weigh in on how that can be improved, it takes years for us to get out of the contract, and it's very expensive to do so. So that's a big issue. The other thing is there are gaps within the regulatory environment. So we have 4 regulators, and there's a lack of coordination between all 4. And that provides an issue for the service providers as well, because they have 4 different regulators to try to cope with, and sometimes they're not in sync. They are at cross purposes. So having harmonization within the regulatory environment would be helpful. And then finally, more information sharing across the ecosystem so that we can get ahead of these threats. We don't have top secret clearance, so we don't have information as it's becoming available through counterintelligence and all the work we're doing at the government side. We would like to have more information and regarding vulnerability so that we can get ahead, because we feel like we're about a half step behind in this area.
Mr. Newgard, continuing along this line of logic and a very important discussion, in your testimony you discussed that we should focus on creating greater uniformity among the financial regulators' cybersecurity standards. Can you expand on this, and in particular discuss what cybersecurity practices that the federal agencies now expect from you?
Yes, so we are regulated by the FDIC and the Idaho State Department of Finance. So there are other regulatory agencies out there. There's the OCC, there's the Fed. So what we comply with may not be what, say, Wells Fargo has to comply with. And I'm not saying that one size fits all, but there should be some more harmonization so that we can have best in class regulation. And this is an area that we really need to step up and work together.
Mr. Vazquez, could you discuss the challenges in training employees to be prepared for cybersecurity threats?
Absolutely, sir, and thank you for that question. Our employees, as with any other company's employees, they're part of our security stack, as we would say. They're part of our tool chest. We know that they are highly targeted. Today's world, as I mentioned in my opening, social engineering is the easiest and fastest way for a malicious actor to get into our network. It's cheap for them to send a ton of emails that come through and just takes one click. It's amazing how a click allows a malicious actor to gain a foothold in and then go lateral into to our critical data. It's super important that we do maintain training for our employees. We have done so. We test ourselves multiple times. We work with our learning department in ensuring that we provide the materials to train our employees. We are sending out notices via our PSAs to remind them. We just went through the Cybersecurity Month, which highlighted the importance of cybersecurity and the role that our employees face.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Vazquez. The gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate your hosting this hearing. I thank the ranking member as well. And I am concerned about minority banks. I happen to have Unity National Bank in my congressional district. It's a small bank, but it serves a niche. And we want to do all that we can to protect all of our banks, especially these small banks that are helping communities that otherwise might not have the same opportunities to achieve their goal, our way of banking, because there is no bank in the community. So here's my question. We talk about these reaches in the abstract to a certain extent. When we talk about the cost associated with mega banks having all the technology necessary to protect themselves, whereas the smaller institutions that are $100 million are very small banks. Under $1 billion, you're a small bank. $10 billion, you're still small now. My question is this. What is the amount of money that we're talking about for a small bank to properly acquire the technology necessary to protect itself? And I say this understanding that just for data acquisition to run the bank, I happen to have told that it can cost around $50,000 a month. That's just to have the technology necessary to process the information that you receive to make sure that you can deal with the financial aspect of banking. So what does it cost? What are we talking about? I'd like to get away from the abstract and say it's a lot of money and go right to a number. You don't have to be exact. Just give me some sense of it, please. I'll allow whomever happens to have this intelligence to do so.
Somebody jump in there.
Congressman Green, I'll attempt to address it first. You're correct in identifying the very, very steep cost of just the basic technology. And so we have to think about it in terms of the cost of the core processor is usually the second largest cost on all of our balance sheets or income statements behind people. And that's not including the people that it takes to run the technology. And so, I would surmise that you're talking about a similar size investment in cybersecurity, which is really just going to be cost prohibitive. And so what would be a more interesting approach would be, perhaps the regulators could actually help us. There's some innovative things that are coming out of FDIC. I heard the chairman of the FDIC just yesterday talk about the idea of having the FDIC actually pre-vet and do some vendor due diligence on behalf of all community banks on fintech companies and new technology providers, and essentially vetting those companies so that we know that we could plug into those companies safely and securely. So if the regulators themselves could do something, similar to what Mr. Newgard proposed, which is to, coordinate amongst themselves, but actually conduct a lot of this due diligence for our institutions, we would not only have the opportunity to increase the technology and improve the technology that we're offering to our customers, but also to improve the security of that technology and keep up and compete with these large banks that just, have basically unlimited resources to devote towards both, technology and innovation and security.
Well, I thank you
If I
for
may,
the
I'd
response. Yes, sir, go right ahead.
add to that is that the cost is really based on size and what other offerings you have. So do you have mobility? Do you have internet banking? There are all sorts of different add-ons that you can have with those core providers. So it's tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. And the issue that you really
Is
hit
that
on.
if you are, excuse me, if you don't own it, but you are in a sense leasing it,
Yes.
Is that per month?
So we have to sign a contract
Yes,
for
I
years.
understand. Well, okay,
Yes.
but I'm trying to get some sense of what it is per month. What is it over the 10-year period? Give me more than it could be tens of thousands of dollars, but not say per what amount of time, please.
Yeah, so it really depends on the contract per bank, depending on how big
Well,
it
give me a
is.
general number. Just assume you're doing all of the basics that you need. What would that be? Just basic banking.
It's hard to say. It would be 20,000, I would say, but I can get you more information.
All right, I'd
do
appreciate
that
it.
specifically for what the cost is to our bank.
Okay, thank you. Here's what I'd like to know. I want to make the argument that if we want to maintain smaller banks and keep them in business, that we are going to have to play a role in this. The government is. We're losing small banks on a rapid pace. And I want to do what I can to make sure that we do all that we can to protect them. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. You've been generous with the time.
All right, gentlemen's time has expired. I'd like to recognize Mr. Posey for 5 minutes, but I can't see him on the screen. Mr. Posey, are you out? There you are. All right. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman Perlmutter, for holding this hearing. Mr. Newgard, cybersecurity looks something like other kinds of menaces that we manage through government action. For example, we have police forces to prevent crime and enforce deterrence, but we may expect people will behave rationally to avoid being victims of crime. In fire prevention, we may impose fire codes on individuals and businesses, and also publicly provide a fire department to fight fires. In cybersecurity, we apparently impose regulations on financial institutions. We also have agencies in government who fight cyber attacks and cybercrime and enforcement laws. Are we achieving the right balance between regulating financial institutions and law enforcement to prevent cyber attacks and protect our financial institutions and the people that they serve?
Yes, thank you. So there needs to be more coordination between the police force, if you will, the regulators, more harmonization, so that we are getting best in class approach to that policing, if you will. And then it's not just us. That's the issue here, is that we are in truly an ecosystem where you can focus on just the financial institution, but you can have a breach. And here's the thing, is that the criminals are going to go after the weakest link. So they're going to go after the most unsophisticated customer or the smallest business to try to get in. And the retailers, the other fintechs, screen scrapers, all these entities are not subject to the same examination and regulation. So the police force they're ignoring that area where they're very focused on us, which is great. We embrace that regulation, but it needs to be throughout the whole ecosystem.
Thank you. When a government agency like the CFPB imposes regulations on financial institutions to fight cyber attacks and cybercrime, we would expect that the agency would perform a cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effective analysis to ensure we're getting efficient regulation or at least minimizing the cost of regulation. Can you please share your experience with us in that regard?
The cost of the regulation?
Yeah, does CFPB look at alternative ways of regulating in this regard or to pick the most efficient way to achieve the goal, or do they merely impose their preferred alternative without looking at other means?
I'm not as familiar with them in particular. We are regulated by the FDIC and Idaho State Department of Finance, and have a great relationship with them. But they're, again, looking for more harmonizations with the OCC, the Fed, to get best-in-class regulation.
Yeah, looking at a broad array of cybersecurity issues, it looks like we have a number of federal agencies regulating financial institutions to improve security. Clearly, do you believe it would make sense to have a single agency or a private sector standards bureau to design the cybersecurity standards we impose on financial institutions? And, would it help to make cybersecurity regulation more efficient and less redundant?
Yes, well, right now we have a patchwork throughout all the states, and that becomes very problematic. So having standardization would be good. I would say that one size does not fit all institutions, so that we do need to keep that in mind, that we are not the same as Wells Fargo. So we have to keep that in mind, but having some standardization and harmonization would be great.
One of the clear roles of government is protecting individual rights and especially private property rights. Without those protections, our market economy can't operate effectively, if it can operate at all. Is the federal government investing enough resources in cybersecurity countermeasures and law enforcement to adequately deter cyber attacks and protect our financial institutions and the public they serve?
I think there's a tremendous effort on counterintelligence. Where I live, we have the Idaho National Lab has a great effort in that area. There's a lot of information out there, but it doesn't always flow down to the smaller banks and financial institutions. And I'm a big advocate of sharing that information throughout our entire system and in a timely way. To learn a week later after a proposed attack is too late. We need to be much more timely on these issues.
I see my time has expired. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Illinois. Dr. Foster is also the chair of the task force on artificial intelligence, and he is now recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, is it likely that there will be time for a second round of questions?
I'll talk to my counterparts over here, but yes.
And get us a reading on that, it would be great. Many of our witnesses noted that small financial institutions are becoming increasingly dependent on third-party core processors. Credit unions in particular frequently rely on third-party technology providers to process for the processes that credit unions need, but these aren't cost efficient to provide in-house, particularly for smaller ones. So in some cases, however, these vendors might not follow the cybersecurity standards that are consistent with what is required of credit unions, or they might not be familiar with the financial regulations concerning credit unions. Now, once upon a time, the National Credit Union Administration, NCUA, had temporary authority to examine third-party vendors to address, in that case, the Y2K issue, but that authority expired in 2002. Now, recently, the NCUA, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and the Government Accountability Office have all requested that this authority be reinstated for modern cyber threats. So my bill that's being noticed today, the Strengthening Cybersecurity for the Financial Sector Act of 2021, would simply make credit unions, federal home loan banks, and government-sponsored enterprises subject to the Bank Service Company Act, which would give the NCUA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the same oversight of third-party vendors that bank regulators have for banks. And I have to mention how gratified I am that at a time when it seems like nobody is able to get along with each other in Washington, that even above getting Democrats and Republicans to work together, we've been able to get the banks and the credit unions united behind the support for this legislation. So I'm very grateful for that. And so, Mr. Vazquez, could you describe a little more about the need for stronger regulation of the service providers in this area, particularly in light of the increasing market concentration that we see in this industry?
Absolutely, sir, and thank you for that. Everything you just mentioned, we agree with in that the NCUA should have the greater authority to be able to regulate our vendors. As mentioned before, and I think Mr. Newgard mentioned it, the vendors seem to have a playbook where they know a breach is coming. Breaches are coming so fast that it's almost, it doesn't affect us as it used to be. A vendor now probably has a playbook to say, if we get a breach, all we have to do is, wait for the next news cycle and it'll go away. We'll do a little bit of marketing to get our reputation back and they move on. There's nothing that prevents them from doing so. I think that to help, at least with the credit unions, to ensure that we value our members' data, we want to make sure that nobody has access to that. We want to ensure that the vendors have that same feeling, that there is some kind of process for them to understand that they have access to our data. It's not just a commodity to them to make money and to move forward, but that they need to protect that data as well as we protect the data.
Thank you. And is there a second level of sort of correlated risk that we should be worrying about? For example, the same way that a core provider can go down and impact many banks, if several core providers, for example, all use the same cloud service, they all used AWS or they all used SolarWinds, would the legislation we're proposing adequately cover the ability to look upstream and above just directly at the core processors, but the people they're dependent on? Does it go all the way upstream, and is there a need for it?
I think there is a need for that, and I'll give an example. I believe CloudStar was just a company that was a victim of ransomware, and CloudStar hosts in their systems many title companies as they do their business. We work with a title company that use CloudStar. Because CloudStar is a third-party vendor, we don't have access to CloudStar to ask about our data that may have been on their systems. So we worked with our title company vendor and to see if they were affected. They were. They had to rebuild from scratch everything that they had to do, but they could not provide us back what CloudStar had, what CloudStar went through, what CloudStar's data was affected. So having more regulations upstream, as you mentioned, going to the third-party contractors would definitely help us ensure that we have the comfort knowing that if a vendor that we contract with subcontracts out to other areas to have their data, that flow continues on.
Thank you. My time is up, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Chairman Perlmutter, I appreciate your leadership in holding this very, very important hearing, and I appreciate the sentiments of Chair Waters in talking about the need to tackle this in a bipartisan way. I think we can, we should. It's overdue. This is a huge matter. There is some discussion about what's the right approach here, more harmonized regulation. I think there's a private sector innovation point to be made. It's not black and white, it can be both. But Mr. Newgard, can you give us an example of some private sector innovation that has made the financial system more secure from cyber attacks?
Private sector.
Private sector innovation.
Okay, so of course our core providers, those would be private sector, and we really rely, as I mentioned before, rely on them for that innovation almost solely. And the fintechs are coming online. That's private sector. So by the way, we pay about 51,000.
sorry to interrupt, but they are providing increasingly innovative solutions for your institution?
Yes, absolutely. We want them to do more.
Let
in
me
terms of
let me ask you
innovation.
about let me ask you about regulation then. Are there regulatory requirements that cause institutions like yours, smaller banks, to shift more resources on regulatory compliance rather than investing in cybersecurity and strengthening cybersecurity? In other words, are regulatory compliance burdens hampering your ability to invest in financial technology cybersecurity?
Absolutely. The increased regulation makes it very difficult for small banks. That's why to scale. That's why you're seeing it.
Let me get into this
Banks
issue of core.
consolidate.
Okay, sorry, sir. Let me get into this issue of core processors. And I've heard this from my constituent community institutions. The take it or leave it kind of contract approach that they express vociferously. They're expressing frustration with that. And I take seriously the suggestion, the recommendation from both you and Mr. James about harmonization of regulation and my colleagues' legislation to bring these third-party vendors under supervision. I'm open to that. But my question is, the problem appears to be inadequate competition. How do we get more competition in financial technology and among the core processors so you have greater choices of contracts for these services, which would not only bring down costs potentially, but also encourage greater private sector innovation in this space? And is it a concern that more regulation on them could potentially have the opposite effect of actually encouraging greater consolidation among core providers, which we don't want?
So we pay $51,500 that we budget a month in cost for our core provider with Fiserv. It's very expensive. We rely on them for technology, but the problem is they don't keep up with innovation. So then fintech comes in and provides that solution, but they're very unproven, very new, and they don't have the regulatory guidance. So they are at risk for cyber attacks.
If I could shift over to Mr. James, because I'm very sympathetic to the problem that MDIs face and other small institutions face. And in your testimony, you talked about needing to level the playing field. And my last question here is, how do we level the playing field for MDIs and small banks? I assume you're able to, through the tax code, deduct your investments in technology as a business expense. But clearly, the economies of scale of your larger competitors puts you at a disadvantage. Besides the regulatory harmonization, what else would help MDIs and community banks level the playing field and access the technology you need?
So, yeah, Mr. Barr, I think it's a great question. I think some of the answer there lies in regulation, but some of it does lie in competition and being able to access competitors to these companies. So oftentimes what happens is when a good competitor comes along to one of the big core processors, they'll go and buy that company rather than allow them to grow enough to be able to provide services to more of our institutions. And so, I think we really need to look at those contracts, and we need to look at encouraging more competition so that we can move to different providers that are more flexible and more secure and provide our customers with better service.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who's also the chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Naturally, this hearing is focusing on defending ourselves from cyber attack and hacking. We shouldn't just be focused on defense, but perhaps in classified sessions, focused on offense, especially when we're dealing with state actors or actors that are protected by states. The U.S. has done little or nothing in this area. There was action taken against Iran's nuclear program that delayed it for a while by either Israel or the United States. Our intel community conjures up an image that they could make the lights flicker in the Kremlin or turn off the Internet Research Agency's operations in St. Petersburg. They just choose not to. I have no idea if that's correct, but I do know that Congress should be fully apprised of what are our offensive capacities, what could we do to develop them, what should be our policies as to whether to threaten to use them or actually use them, or maybe not. Instead, we are here, as we are in many hearings, talking about a shield without ever talking about a sword. If we're not in a position to deter what some foreign governments are doing or deliberately allowing and encouraging, we're going to have an even bigger problem. Turning to the private sector, we want to make sure the private sector spends more and does the best possible job. Basic economic theory says that the costs of a data breach should be imposed on those who could invest in safety measures and who should spend the appropriate amount of money and care in safeguarding data. When Americans focus on the issues of this hearing, their first thought is on the big and well-publicized and sometimes smaller and not well-publicized data breaches where their personal information, particularly their credit card information, comes into the hands of ne'er-do-wells and criminals. But our policy has been that if a big retailer has millions of credit card data files stolen, they don't face any liability. If it's a really big one, they may face some reputational risk, but all the costs are borne by the financial institutions. Mr. James, would we get better investment by big retailers in safeguarding data if it was the retailers that had to pay the money that was occasioned by the breach?
Mr. Sherman, I definitely think that you'd see a renewed interest in protecting this data if some of those retailers who are a part of this ecosystem that Mr. Newgard just so eloquently described bore some responsibility. I mean, if our institution has a debit card that is breached or a check account number that's breached, ultimately we bear the responsibility for recouping that customer's funds. And those retailers that have, particularly very, very large retailers that have massive data operations, are not really subject to any responsibility for protecting consumer data, certainly not the way that we are. And so, I certainly don't want to impose, onerous costs on our small businesses, our small customers, that are retailers.
I would just interrupt and say that the big hackers are not going after the small businesses. The treasure trove is in the big ones. I do have a question for Mr. Vazquez with regard to the question of expanding National Credit Union Administration oversight of credit union third-party vendors. A primary concern is the risks with credit union service organizations. In your view, do these credit union service organizations and vendors pose the same level of risk to credit unions and customers? And if not, are there specific types of risks that would be more appropriate for NCUA oversight than others?
Sir, thank you for that question, and I do believe that they have the same type of risk. When a credit union such as Canvas partners with a QSO or a vendor, and we provide them our data so that our members can have a better service, we're basically, in some areas, people would think that we're transferring our risk to the vendor. And some people would think that we are now hands-off with that risk. We're expecting our member or our vendor to take that risk. But ultimately, that risk still resides with Canvas. That is our members' data. And we could try and transfer it, but it's really ours. And we hope to expect that the vendors and the QSOs that have our data would have that same, maintain that same recognition of securing that data and have the same risk that we have.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for his questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And we've seen a wave of new proposed regulations coming out of the Biden administration that will cause banks to dedicate a significant amount of money towards new compliance costs. For smaller community banks, like the ones I deal with and most people, this means they will have less resources available to lend money into their communities and or dedicate to cybersecurity efforts, and bottom line, it hurts Main Street America. Whether it's be asking banks to report account information from their customers to the IRS or being forced to comply with a 900-page rule coming out of the CFPB on reporting small business loan information, these actions will force banks to divert significant amounts of resources. There's no question about that because they have no clue on what's going to cost them. So, Mr. Newgard, can you tell us how your bank has been adjusting with some of these potential new compliance costs coming down the pipeline?
Yes, it's extremely expensive and it continues to ramp up. So we are looking at hiring additional people to comply with things such as Bank Secrecy Act, all the other compliance burden, and simply you have to get scale in order to be able to bear that cost. And that's why you're seeing a tremendous amount of consolidation in our industry, is because it's so expensive to comply, and the burden of the regulation continues to go up.
Well, in the end, your customer is hurt in the total end. As cyber threats are getting more sophisticated, there is a need for financial institutions to understand the threats and outages facing their third-party service providers. Unfortunately, I've heard from some of my market participants in Texas that the financial regulators are working on a new rule regarding computer incident notification requirements that could impose a significant new burden, here we go, a new burden on community banks. I understand that the need to have transparency in the digital systems of the financial system to ensure proper steps can be taken when something else goes wrong. However, I'm concerned that the rule as currently proposed could both make community banks responsible for deciphering complex cyber incident notifications and cause market participants to share so much information with the regulators that they will not be able to determine what issues deserve attention. So, Mr. Newgard, again, can you give us your thoughts on how we can strike the correct balance with cyber's notifications so banks can receive timely information from their service providers without creating an overly burdensome review and reporting process for banks, and again, hurting Main Street?
That's right. We already comply with good cybersecurity practices, and what we would ask is for harmonization within the regulatory bodies, and then to spread that risk and liability to those that don't have it today, the retailers, the core providers, and the other people within the ecosystem. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Lastly, I've talked with many different fintech firms in my district that have been dealing with a patchwork regulatory system of data security requirements coming out of different states. From my experience, what works in California, it doesn't work in Texas. I repeat, what works in California does not work in Texas. And Mr. Newgard, can you briefly discuss the benefits that your institution would see should a uniform data security standard come out of Washington? That's pretty scary.
Yes, we're not in favor of one size fits all. We do need harmonization. I'll stress that again, but definitely a one size fits all doesn't work.
Okay. So I would just say in closing, as a business person that employ hundreds of people, still have my business, regulations hurt community banks, makes them sometimes not competitive. At the end of the day, affects your borrowers who are trying to grow their company and put more people to work. So regulations do not help Main Street. And with that in mind, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California. Mr. Vargas is recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much this hearing, and I want to thank the ranking member also. I have to say, though, there was a quip stated something like, what happened last night, of course, had no influence on the bipartisanship. I have to say, for me, zero, none, because I really don't like the Atlanta Braves or the Houston Astros, either one of those teams. Now, if it had been those Rockies or my beloved Padres that had won, well, it's different. But since they weren't there, I really don't care too much about what happened last night. Now, Mr. Newgard, I do want to ask you, you said that there's very little cost to the core providers when there's a breach. You also said the contracts are very expensive and they're only long-term. The way the market's supposed to work is, if this is the case, there should be another actor that comes in, another participant with innovation to bring the cost down. Why hasn't that happened?
So the core providers are 3 or 4, and by the way, we pay about we budget $51,500 a month for that service. So we really push on those core providers to innovate, and many times they are slower than we would like them to be, and slower than our consumers and the small businesses would like to move. So that is where the fintech comes in. That's why we have a whole industry of fintech, is because of innovation. The issue is they are not subject to regulation, GLBA, and the issue is they're startups. So they're brand new, have not much history.
I understand that, but I'm asking, why in the core providers, why aren't there a new startup there? I mean, in other words,
Right.
why isn't there competition there? That's usually what happens in our market society.
Well, yes, Mr. James stated this very well, is that once one starts up, it is purchased. So it just becomes part of the whole. They don't even hardly let them get legs under them before they're consolidated.
Now, there was, it's been interesting because I think Mr. Barr and certainly Mr. Williams and others have said, we don't like regulation. And yet, a lot of the witnesses today want to seem to extend regulation to the core providers. I mean, it's been fascinating to listen to what you on the private side have said tonight. I mean, almost everybody says, you know, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act should be extended. The Privacy Act should be extended. There should be harmonization. I assume you mean to make sure that the core providers, fintech, and everybody else has these regulations that they don't have now. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Then I do, because I mean, we always have that fight that no regulations, good regulations. And we always think, well, no, you have to have regulations. And we just saw that going through this pandemic, a lot of banks didn't fail because we had some good regulations. I do want to ask Mr. Jain, if I could, government information sharing. You talked about that and said that we should have more of that and it should be actionable in real time. Could you comment a little bit more about that? Because we do spend a lot of money at the federal government level with respect to cybersecurity. What are we doing wrong?
Well, I think we've learned that, I mean, we've talked about information sharing for many years, and I think we've learned that information sharing or effective information sharing is hard because it's not just a matter of sharing some isolated technical indicators. What you really need is context and enough information and real-time and actionable information that if a network defender receives the information, they can look at it and they can say, oh, here's a copy of a phishing email that is being sent around that people are using to get access to people's networks. I can block that email, or I can look for that kind of an email and block it.
Mr. Jain, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because my time will run out. Why aren't we doing that? I understand that part. You told us that. Why aren't we doing that? Why can't we do that?
I think we're getting there. I mean, I think it's taken us a while to realize that's what we need. And so I think, some of the innovations coming out of CISA around the Joint Collaborating Center that they just announced, I think is moving in this direction. But, I think it's going to take more resources and, and trying to get it economy-wide is going to take time. So I think we're moving in that direction, but we still need more time to get it there.
Yeah, I just have 4 seconds left. The only thing I would say is go Padres. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the gentleman yields back on that note, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is here to talk about the Atlanta Braves, I'll bet, but he's now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate my colleague from California and understand that there was no California team good enough to make it to the World Series. So I understand why he was not affected by the game last night. But go Braves, America's team. So, and by the way, Mr. Chairman, the Braves are in my district, so we're celebrating here today.
All right, gentleman gets an extra 30 seconds because the Braves were in his district.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll use it wisely. One of the things, cybersecurity and the cyber threats is one of the issues that I have been working on since I've been in Congress. I spent some time in the military and intelligence. Of course, security is a big issue for those in that field, especially protecting the data, the information that we have. I also spent 20 years running and owning a IT business, which again, security was a main concern for our customers, and we want to make sure that their networks were secure. However, being here in Congress, I see that quite often we will take 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. Sometimes we'll go 6 steps backwards. And I'm going back to some of the basic tenets of what it means to secure data. And one of the primary tenets that we were taught in the military and that I've kept throughout my businesses is this one principle. You don't have to protect what you don't have. You don't have to protect what you don't have, meaning do not keep something that could be vulnerable just for the sake of having it. And what we do here in the federal government through mandates and regulations, and especially the idea that's being proposed right now for the banks to spy on everyone's bank account and then all of that information by small institutions, large institutions, whatever is going to be sent to the federal government, which is, again, data that they don't need and they don't need to have. And so we've seen this continual flow of taking on more and more responsibility. The government either forcing businesses to keep data that they really don't need, or forcing the businesses to send it to the federal government, which is a huge cybersecurity risk in itself, in my opinion. So I think we take 1 step forward and several steps backwards in trying to figure out better ways of securing data, which the bad guys are always going to be 1 step ahead of you, right? And when we really don't need to have this data to secure. Another issue that I've been working on is the need for some type of uniform national data security breach notification standard. One of the issues is we have so many different standards throughout the nation that institutions have to comply with various state laws, and those are often conflicting with the Graham-Leach-Bailey Act and other federal requirements. And it adds unnecessary complexity to the cybersecurity efforts, in my opinion. So, Mr. Newgard, if banks were able to operate under a single set of rules, would that allow you to spend more of your time and resources defending against cyber attacks?
Yes, having harmonization within the regulatory bodies would help significantly. And then voluntarily, we ask to share that breach information. And what we really need is to have more information shared from the government to us. And I loved your comment about having too much data sent. That doesn't make sense. I think you're spot on there.
And that's one of the areas that we just tend to gloss over, and I've been bringing this up over and over in this committee, is that we keep talking about cybersecurity and we put onus on the businesses to be more secure, but then we require them to take more and more, which they don't need to be taking. So I appreciate that. Another issue I've been focused on is payments fraud. Point-of-sale payments fraud has been significantly declined thanks to the adoption of chip technology, but the problem has shifted toward digital payments. Mr. Vazquez, what are credit unions doing to enhance the security of digital payments?
Thank you, sir, for that question. And we're partnering, we partner with Co-op for our digital payments, and we work with them to ensure that they are monitoring for fraud. We have a department ourselves that monitors for fraud. So we are, even though we spend quite a bit of money on my area, which is cybersecurity, we do spend the same amount of money in our fraud area to make sure that we have the right tools and the right people to monitor. And it's important that the tools that we have are real-time tools, so that they're not a day old, and the fraud that's happening isn't escaping while we're waiting for the information to come in. We're working with our vendors to ensure that the data we have is real time, so we can prevent the fraud.
All right, thank you. I see my time is expired, and I'll submit the other questions for the record, but thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlemen's time has expired. We should all applaud the Braves. They played a good game last night. We will do a second round quickly. We have Ms. Presley first and Mr. Rose, and then if you wish, we will do a second round. I'm also going to make a suggestion that Mr. Loudermilk, you get together with Mr. Foster and talk about this kind of stuff, because I think between the two of you, and after listening to this panel, we're going to have some good ideas as to what we should do. So now I'd like to recognize the gentleman.
Mr. Chair, Representative Loudermilk and I are already primary sponsors of some key legislation on digital identity.
See? Okay, good. It's already working.
Your wish is our command.
All right. Can I now like to recognize the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, who is also the vice chair of this committee, and ask her to present her questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You forgot to mention in my introduction, and the Congresswoman for the Massachusetts 7th, proudly representing the Boston Red Sox. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this important
I apologize.
That's all right. Let the record reflect. But in all seriousness, through the first half of this year, banks and credit unions experienced a 1,318% increase in ransomware attacks, wherein attackers had private data hostage, they held it up and threatened to publish it should the victim not pay. You heard that right, 1,318%. So this is a substantial and immediate threat to consumers in our financial system that really does require a substantial and immediate response. The largest financial institutions devote tremendous resources to addressing cyber risks, yet smaller regional and community financial institutions don't have those resources or capabilities. Even though cyber attacks on smaller institutions can also harm consumers and cause serious disruption. In fact, in 2020, over 25% of cybersecurity breaches involved were small business victims. So, Mr. Jain, what sorts of challenges do financial institutions face in the prevention and detection of these attacks, especially when it comes to smaller regional and community financial institutions?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think they face a number of challenges. As we've talked about, they have significantly less resources, obviously, than the big players, both in terms of monetary resources to invest, but also in terms of access to in-house expertise. We have a shortage in the cyber workforce, I think, around this country, and so smaller institutions in particular, I think, have a harder time getting the in-house expertise they need. The information sharing, as we've talked about, is important, and while the big institutions are able to, for example, have people in the government centers that are designed for information sharing, that's obviously not possible for the smaller institutions. And so finding the right ways for information to get to smaller institutions in a way that's actionable in real time remains, I think, a challenge. And then I think, in many ways, smaller institutions have a greater dependence on vendors and other service providers because the big banks can provide a lot of these capabilities or develop them in-house. And as we've talked about, that has, vendors create all sorts of security problems.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. And just building on that, I think that certainly makes the case for exactly why we need to address the fact that there are nearly 500,000 unfilled cybersecurity jobs across the nation. And this is why the Build Back Better Act makes these robust investments in cybersecurity workforce developments with training opportunities at community colleges HBCUs, and for our veterans. The Biden administration has partnered with private companies such as IBM, headquartered in my district, which is committed to train more than 150,000 people in cybersecurity skills over the next 3 years, working with more than 20 HBCUs to build a more diverse cyber workforce. Mr. Jain, just sticking with you for a moment here, how will these investments that I just enumerated help our nation combat growing cybersecurity risk in the financial services sector?
I mean, I think it's crucial because, as you say, we do have a huge shortage of cybersecurity workers, and our system is set up where we're expecting every business, every small business, to have that kind of cybersecurity expertise, and so that mismatch creates a real problem. And obviously, when you have that kind of shortage, just the basic law of supply and demand means that they can demand, cybersecurity workers can demand really large salaries, which again becomes a handicap for smaller institutions. So I think there's no doubt that one part of this has to be to increase our cyber workforce.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. And before my time totally goes, yes, these investments are certainly necessary to ensure that we have an equitable recovery to provide those good paying jobs and to diversify this sector. Just talking for a moment, transitioning to the issue of consumer justice and cybersecurity, under the Graham-Leach-Billy Act, covered financial institutions must inform customers of their data sharing practices and allow customers to opt out of sharing their information with third parties. But most consumers, as you all know, I mean, we're consumers ourselves, don't have the time to read privacy policies, and others may not understand the policy or that they even have opt-out rights. So as a result, many of these folks are not opting out. Mr. Jain, you argue that this opt-out system places the burden of privacy protection on the individual consumer, and that the result of this shortcoming is that the GLBA effectively adopts a default of broad sharing of consumer financial information. So how would you recommend that Congress change this data privacy burden, so that more of it falls on the companies and not the consumer?
Yeah, so I think we need to move away from this idea of notice and consent, that as long as consumers have notice, we have this fictional idea that they've consented, and start imposing some basic obligations on the entities that are collecting and processing this information so that, among other things, to require them to only collect the information they really need to provide the product or service that the individual is signed up for. And then if they want to use it for another purpose, then they have to come back to the consumer and say, hey, we want to share your data for this reason. Is that okay? And if the consumer then expressly opts in, fine. But not sort of default to sort of, hey, we can hide this stuff in the privacy policy, and if you don't take the time to read it and check this box to opt out, we can do what we want.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Boston's time has expired.
Thank you.
We will now turn to Mr. Kustoff, who has reemerged on the platform, and he is now he's from Tennessee and is now recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for convening today's hearing. Thank you again to the witnesses, and Mr. Jain, thank you for personally appearing today. Mr. Jain, if I could ask you, going back to your prior life and government, both with DOJ and the National Security Council, can you compare and contrast, if you will, how the cyber threat environment has changed from the time you left government to now?
Yeah, I think it's become more problematic. I think we're seeing an increased number of sophisticated cyber actors, not only nation states, but increasingly criminal enterprises that have access to sophisticated capabilities. So in that sense, it's become significantly more challenging. We're seeing more brazen attacks. I think, previously, 5-10 years ago, most of the attacks you saw were either things like denial of service or theft of whether it was information or even money. But today we're seeing so many more attacks that are actually disruptive, operationally disruptive, as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline and the likes, where they're really attacking critical infrastructure and really disrupting people's lives and basic services that people need. So I think in that respect, it's actually become a more serious problem for us.
Yeah, if I could, Mr. Jain, specifically about financial institutions, can you characterize how the threats have changed during the time you left government to now as it relates specifically to financial institutions?
Sure. I mean, one obvious change has been the rise of ransomware. I mean, I think a number of you have now mentioned the statistic about the 1,300% increase in ransomware attacks on banks. And, and that in a financial institution context obviously has major issues because it means that consumers, for example, may not be able to access their accounts or may not be able to use banking and financial services, in a timely manner when they really need it. So I think that's one example of where it's really had an effect. And I also think it's important to recognize, we've talked a lot about the financial system as an ecosystem, but it's not only a financial ecosystem, but it's a broader ecosystem than that, right? So for example, financial institutions rely on power. So to the extent that power companies and utilities are at risk for cyber attacks, that's going to have a downstream effect on financial institutions as well. And so the risk to critical infrastructure broadly affects all, I think, companies, including in the financial institution space.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. And Mr. Newgard, if I could with you and maybe follow up on what Mr. Jain just talked about as it relates to the ecosystem. And of course, you mentioned that interconnected ecosystem in your written testimony. Can you talk about that and how an attack on big banks ultimately could filter down to smaller banks and community banks, et cetera?
Sure. An attack on any financial institution, whether it be a large bank, whether it be a credit union or a small community bank, impacts significantly the overall financial system. And it hurts trust and it hurts communities.
I mean, essentially, it is a domino effect. One attack on the larger banks is a domino to other banks down the ecosystem.
That's right, certainly. But I'd also say that an attack on a service provider, a core provider, if they get in there, if a perpetrator gets in there, look at how many community banks would be affected. We're talking about thousands of community banks and communities being affected by an attack on them as well.
So not necessarily a direct attack on a community bank or a smaller bank, but from a best practices standpoint, what could a community bank do to protect itself against attacks at larger financial institutions or banks?
I would say having the harmonization of the regulatory regulators and also having those service providers be examined and have them be accountable to those requirements. Because the bigger institutions have their own cores, if you will. They do a lot of this in-house, where we're reliant on third parties.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Another gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Perlmutter and Ranking Member Luetkemeyer for holding this hearing, and to our witnesses for being here with us today. Unfortunately, cyber attacks across Tennessee and our nation are on the rise. While the ransomware attack that targeted the Colonial Pipeline and the cyber attack on JBS in the meatpacking sector have dominated the headlines this year, there have been countless other attacks affecting millions of Americans. And the financial sector, in particular, is routinely a major target of malicious cyber actors. In order for our nation to meet the unique challenges posed by cyber attacks, it is essential that we have an adequate number of qualified cybersecurity professionals. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that there is a substantial shortage of qualified cybersecurity professionals in this country. According to the data gathered under the Commerce Department grant, there are nearly, and as Representative Presley just pointed out, nearly 465,000 unfilled cyber jobs in the U.S. To help combat the shortage of cybersecurity professionals, the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency have designated centers of academic excellence in cybersecurity. I am proud to represent one such center of academic excellence in my district, the Cybersecurity Education, Research, and Outreach Center, located at Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville, Tennessee, my alma mater, was established in 2015 as an effort to integrate university-wide initiatives in cyber security education and research. One of the goals at Tennessee Tech Center of Excellence is to help supply highly trained students into the cybersecurity workforce. While I think we can all be appreciative of the work being done at Tennessee Tech to help fill these critically important jobs, there is clearly more work to be done. Mr. Newgard, as the chair of the Cyber and Data Security Committee at the Independent Community Bankers of America, would you talk a little about the challenges the financial sector faces when it comes to recruiting qualified cybersecurity professionals?
This is a huge issue, and I would say that Governor Little from Idaho has created a cybersecurity task force to address some of these workforce issues. This is bigger than we really realize, because as the threat continues to increase, so is the demand for cyber professionals. We need more people. The issue within the financial institutions is our ability to pay for these talented people, because they get scooped up by other entities that are bigger and can pay larger salaries. So it's a challenge to keep and attract good talent in the cyber area.
Thank you, Mr. Newgard. I've spent my career in the IT training space and spent quite a bit of time through my own business helping to train cyber security professionals. And one of the old sayings we had in that industry is, if you train your employees, and you make reference to this, if you train your employees, they'll leave you and go on to better opportunities. The only thing worse than that is not training them and having them stay. And I'm sure, Mr. Newgard, you probably agree with that. Mr. Jain, I'd also welcome your input here regarding any challenges that you see when it comes to recruiting qualified cybersecurity professionals.
Sure. I think, as Representative Presley alluded to, I think one of our challenges is making sure that we are drawing from our entire citizenry in terms of encouraging them to enter into the cyber workforce. I mean, we know for a long time, for various reasons, women and girls have been more reluctant to get into technology. We know that minorities sometimes don't see the same opportunities. And so I think part of the solution to increasing the number of cyber workers that we have is making sure that we're doing everything we can to reach out and provide the opportunities really across the board to everyone, both including underrepresented communities, because I think that's going to be critical in order for us to actually get the number of cyber workers we need.
I'm wondering, Mr. Jain and Mr. Newgard, if you believe that there is adequate credentialing or verification of the talents and capabilities of cybersecurity professionals today, or if you think there's more work to be done there. I mentioned the program at Tennessee Tech, but historically, there's been some question about whether our cybersecurity professionals really know their stuff. Could you all comment on that in the remaining seconds we have?
Sure, I'm a big fan of certifications. I think certifications keep up quite well. We just need to have the workforce to do that, and potentially grants to help fund those.
I would just add in 2 seconds that I think it's also important to recognize that we shouldn't just assume that if you're to be a cybersecurity professional, you need a computer science degree. I think we need to have different kinds of certifications and recognize that different kinds of skills can be useful.
Thank you both. I see my time has expired, and thank you, Chair Perlmutter, for indulging me.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like again to welcome everyone to the committee. This has been quite interesting. And the ranking member, Luetkemeyer, for especially holding this because it becomes so critical now. My question is going to go to Mr. Newgard first. As you know, we are in an age where there is an increased reliance on technology, and with that comes an increased need to protect consumers. sensitive data. Financial institutions are pairing with technology services to provide other third-party vendors that are not versed in federal regulation that protect consumer. Based off your experience, do you believe programs that help close the gaps and establish digital cybersecurity infrastructure plans will be utilized by financial institutions?
We are extremely reliant on third parties. And so anything that can be make them more accountable is good. The other thing is, as part of this ecosystem, having retailers, core providers, everybody else within that ecosystem made accountable for the consumer information and the liability associated with that as well. If they have a breach, they have to pay. That would go a long ways.
Okay, thank you. And so Jain, cyber crimes, it's stated that it could cost the world up to $10.5 trillion annually by 2025, which is right up the way. With cybercrime cases on the rise, how can federal policy help aid and recovery from financial institutions that are victim to cyber attacks? Most of the proposed solution today discuss preventive measures, but what action can we take to shape policy that would help mitigate the staggering effect of data breach and help financial institutions affect recovery?
So just to give a couple of examples, I think one thing that we should be thinking harder about from a policy perspective is whether there are points in the ecosystem where imposing requirements or requiring certain security practices can have benefits that sort of propagate across the ecosystem. So if you think, for example, of software providers or internet service providers, to the extent they up their security game, they eliminate a bug or a bug doesn't get into software, that has benefits that propagate across the whole ecosystem. I mean, if you think of a program like Windows, when Windows has a problem, it affects everybody. But if we can fix it or we can create incentives so that commonly used software providers or internet service providers who are serving tens of thousands of customers, if we can incentivize them to up their security game, that has benefits for everybody throughout the ecosystem. So I do think one thing that we should be thinking harder about is identifying those kinds of points in the ecosystem, what we can do there to improve security and sort of benefit everybody.
And the $10 million question, as always asked, is, Ms. Jain, is what action could Congress take to improve cybersecurity and prepare to respond to attacks on the financial system, which may impact the entire community and other sectors of our economy?
So, I mean, one action, as I mentioned before, that I think Congress should take is to adopt federal privacy legislation, because I think it really gets to a point that Representative Loudermilk made earlier, albeit from a different perspective, which is that if you have privacy legislation that, for example, requires providers to minimize the amount of data that they're collecting, minimize the amount of sharing that they do, that means there's just less data sloshing around the whole ecosystem, so that if there in fact is a breach, there's less data that's being taken or less people's data that's being taken. And so I actually think there's a real strong link between privacy legislation on the one hand and reducing the effects of the negative effects of data breaches and the like on the other.
And my time is almost run out, but I wanted to leave with you. Is the cybercrime international in scope with other countries now?
Oh, absolutely. I think cybercrime is definitely international and requires international solutions for that reason.
Okay, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from South Carolina, who is the vice chair of the Modernization of Congress Committee, Mr. Timmons is recognized for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. This is extremely important, and I'm just going to begin. I'm actually not going to ask questions during my first 5 minutes because I'm going to take advantage of the second 5 minutes. But please listen to just how I'm going to frame this. So 2012, the Obama administration proposed the Cybersecurity Act that would largely address critical infrastructure. It failed. The Dems at that time had a 58-seat majority, and the right didn't like it because it was overly prescriptive. It was too burdensome on businesses, and portions of the left didn't like it because of privacy concerns. It was too invasive. So let's talk about what's happened since then. We've had billions and billions of dollars worth of damage from cybersecurity breaches, both in the business community and in government. Epsilon, Target, Home Depot, Experian, TJ Maxx, Sony, Veterans Affairs, OPM, they're getting increasing in number, and they're getting increasing in disruptive capacity. Most recently, Colonial Pipeline, which affected my district, resulted in 75% of the gas stations in the 4th Congressional District of South Carolina to be free of gas. They did not have any gas. And I was getting calls all the time. And this is because they didn't have dual-factor authentication on their logins. I mean, so this is basic stuff. The EU passed the General Data Protection Regulation in 2016. A lot of people think that was overly prescriptive. It's created a lot of challenges. California has done the California Consumer Privacy Act. That was in 2018. Colorado just signed one into law in 2021. Legislation is currently pending in Massachusetts, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. If we're going to try to do something in Congress, one, we're kind of late, and two, think about how challenging it's going to be. It would go through at least 8 committees in the House, probably 5 or 6 in the Senate. We don't need to just address the financial services component of cybersecurity and of data privacy. We need to address the whole of the economy and the government of the United States. This is going to become increasingly problematic, and I know that we generally only legislate in crisis moments, but we have an opportunity to get ahead of that. And there's a lot of different ways you can try to craft legislation that would accomplish this objective, but I don't know if we have the will to do it, because committee jurisdiction, people are very protective of their committee's jurisdiction. There's, a possibility of perhaps doing a joint select committee on cybersecurity. We've got to find a way to get everybody's buy-in before we, it needs to be a collaborative process, because the perfect will always be the enemy of the good, and we got to get the experts to write this legislation. It needs to be self-updating. I mean, we can't keep coming back and addressing every new development in technology. We don't have the ability, Congress doesn't do stuff like that. So we're going to get to the questions in my next 5 minutes, but one other thing I want to point out is preemption. What do you think the California delegation is going to do when we say that we're going to do away with the CCPA by federal preemption? We're going to get rid of the law they've worked so hard on. They're going to go crazy. But we can't have a patchwork framework of regulations. It will create such an incredible regulatory burden, such a compliance burden for your banks and your credit unions and for all the businesses. And I guess I'm going to end with this. We're only as good as our weakest link. Small businesses or larger businesses that are breached, let's just use, we'll go with Target or Home Depot. How much money do you think the banks had to spend to reissue tens of millions of debit cards? I mean, that is a compliance cost, and that then is passed along to the end users, to the customers. So this affects so many people. It affects every aspect of our economy, every aspect of our government. We are ill-equipped as a body to address it. We're running out of time. So that's the doom and gloom approach that I'm going to begin with. We're going to ask questions next 5 minutes. But I look forward to y'all weighing in on that assessment of the situation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And to close out this initial round of questioning, we'll have Mr. Torres from New York ask his 5 minutes of questions. Then, with the witnesses' indulgence, I assume that Mr. Foster and Mr. Timmons would like to ask some questions in a second round. And anybody else, Mr. Lawson, Mr. Torres, you're welcome to do the same. So with that, I yield to the gentleman from New York City, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. SolarWinds serves as a wake-up call about the vulnerability of the software supply chain. A malicious actor can target a computer network of a financial institution not only directly, but also indirectly via the supply chain. So we have a critical interest in securing the vulnerable supply chain that supports the financial system. My first question is for Mr. Newgard. Big banks like JP Morgan can invest $1 billion a year in cybersecurity. Do small banks have sufficient resources for cybersecurity, in your estimation?
We do a very good job, I would say, as an industry. What we have done is relied on our core providers because we simply don't have the ability to have all the redundancies and security at that level that the core provider does. I've actually toured those facilities, those data centers, and they have very robust redundancies and security that we couldn't provide.
If I can just interject for a moment, what percentage of a small bank's budget typically goes toward cybersecurity?
So we just on the core side, we spend $51,500 a month, and that's just on our core provider. We have a whole department dedicated to cybersecurity and IT into the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And Mr. Vazquez, same question for you. Do you feel credit unions have sufficient resources for cybersecurity, and what percentage of a credit union's budget on average goes towards cybersecurity?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. I feel like I can answer the same. Credit unions, both large and small, are doing the best they can with the resources they have to mitigate the cybersecurity risks. For us, I can't tell you exactly what the percentage is, but I can tell you that just our cybersecurity budget for tools that we need to ensure that our data is safe is close to $1 million. That does not incorporate the cost of the employees. And as mentioned earlier before, that cost continues to go up as we fight for the right resources to get the right people in to manage these sophisticated tools that we have. A lot of smaller credit unions don't have the budget that we have. I am very, very thankful that our board and our executives are all bought in with cybersecurity and provide that budget for us to be able to buy the right tools, train our people, and ensure that we're doing the right thing.
Mr. Newgard, you're the head of a bank, correct?
CEO.
CEO. Do you typically assess the cyber hygiene of your technology service providers before hiring them or doing business with them?
Yes, we have an extensive vendor due diligence that we go through, and in the cyber area, we are increasing our level of reliance on them. We just went to a managed SOC with Defense Storm recently, which is a cost, but gives us more security.
Do you know if all your technology service providers have a chief information security officer?
Do I know if they have them?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do all of them have multi-factor authentication?
I couldn't answer that broadly.
Do all of them have?
Knowledge of
Do all of those
providers.
technology service providers have third-party assessments of their cybersecurity practices?
I believe so.
And Mr. Vazquez, do you know if credit unions typically assess the cyber hygiene of their technology service providers before doing business with them?
Yes, sir, we do. Fortunately for Grant Canvas, we do have a very robust vendor management program, and that allows us to query our vendors with contracts, ask for their SOC information, ensure that they're following the same practices that we expect them to. To answer an earlier question that you provided, most do have MFA. Some still only have a single sign-on with the username password, and obviously we fight to have them change that. But not all vendors will do that. But yes,
My time is expiring, but if I were, and it might be easier said than done, but if I were a credit union or a bank, I would never do business with any service provider that did not have multi-factor authentication. That is the barest standard of cyber hygiene in the 21st century. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll move to a second round, and with that, I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Dr. Foster, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just first, is the, I guess, this is probably best for Mr. Newgard or Vazquez, is the list of the market shares of all of the core processors publicly available? Are they well-known firms, or are they sort of specialist firms? Just, anyway, if you could,
Yeah, they're pretty,
someone?
yeah, they're pretty well known. Fiserv is the one that we use, but there are about 3 others that dominate that area.
Okay, yeah, if you could respond for the record, just so we get a feeling who the big players are in that. Now, Mr. James, Mr. Newgard, and others, you mentioned problems with the non-competitive markets for core processors, partly due to a consolidation, but also due to vendor capture due to the high cost of switching vendors for core processing. This strikes me as very much like the market for electronic health records, which will effectively capture hospital chains or doctors' offices because of the high cost of switching over to a different competitor for these systems. So one of the things that we've attempted to do in Congress to make a more competitive operation is have data portability standards and interoperability standards so that it's more realistic to switch vendors on this. Is there a need for something like this in this market so you can make it a realistic threat to jump to a competitor? Does anyone want to, have there been discussions?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Sure, I'll jump in, Mr. Foster. I'll give you a quick example. So we had one of our members, a Black-owned bank, that purchased another Black-owned institution that was not doing quite as well, and they just closed on the merger about 3 weeks ago. And the purchasing bank was on one core provider, the target bank was on a different core. They had to pay $1.2 million to the target bank's core provider in order to move that data over to their core, just to integrate.
Yep.
And so there's an enormous amount of cost. And so if we could have some kind of consistency and data portability across these providers, that would really free up competition, because it's extremely onerous. Even if you wait until your contract is expired and you want to move to a new core provider, it's still going to cost you into the high 6 figures in order to do a conversion, which is one of the reasons why a lot of our banks end up staying with the same company over and over again for these long-term contracts. It makes us less competitive. It's very costly. And if we could have some consistency in standards, I think you'd introduce more competition into the marketplace.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. There are markets where it's best for government just gets the heck out, like plain old internet, where we've said, okay, industry figure it out, and any computer can talk to any other. But then there are markets like, like electronic health records, or apparently this market where it just, I guess the natural tendency toward monopoly is just so strong, and toward vendor capture. Many of you have also mentioned identity fraud and synthetic identity fraud, social engineering and phishing attacks. And there's a pretty broad consensus that we have to get away from password-based systems to more secure systems. There has been progress on this, including on the consumer-facing thing, with a rollout of mobile ID, or sometimes called digital driver's licenses, by many states. These were they were a standard that was developed by NIST. Their iPhone and Android are now supporting them as a big part of their recent rollout of new updates of their operating system. And the states, several states are rolling these out. This allows you to essentially turn your cell phone into a security dongle that is associated with a real ID compliant driver's license or other ID or a passport. And these things have the potential to really get rid of a lot of the the agony that business and government sees with identity fraud. And have the rollout in states gone far enough that you've really seen an effect of using these for KYC requirements and so on, or is it still early days? And any of you sort of aware of the use of this? And yeah.
Yeah, we're generally aware of the trend, but it's still very, very early. I know in the state of Georgia where our bank is located, we've not seen that yet. I'm not sure about any of the other panelists, but it's still early days for us.
Yes, sir, and I would agree with Mr. James that technology is in its infancy. We are aware of it and are paying attention to it because we do absolutely believe, as you just mentioned, that passwords are a huge area that allows for compromise. If we can take that away and move to something of what you have and get away from passwords, that would be the perfect solution. But right now, it's the technology, it's in its infancy, and as soon as it matures, we will definitely be looking at that to bring into Canvas.
Yeah, I believe the technology is actually mature.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized, and we'll see if he can ask any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jain, do you agree that Congress should preempt states and pass a comprehensive cybersecurity and data privacy framework for the U.S. economy?
I definitely agree that Congress should pass that kind of legislation. I think on the preemption question, I would say two things. One, it's hard to answer the preemption question without knowing how strong the substantive protections are, because obviously if it's a really weak substantive privacy law, then that would, I think, mean that we wouldn't support preemption. And then the second point I'd make is that I don't think preemption is an all or nothing thing. In other words, it's not we preempt everything or we preempt nothing. I think, there are some laws, like you've referenced, like the California law and the Colorado law, which would be fairly parallel in some ways to a federal privacy law, where, if it was strong enough, it may make sense to preempt. On the other hand, there are other laws of general applicability that sometimes may read on privacy, whether it's civil rights laws that protect against discrimination or unfair and deceptive trade practice laws that deal with people who are deceptive in describing their privacy practices, where preemption, I think, may not make sense. But I think there's room there to talk.
Sure. I have concerns about Congress's capacity to craft such legislation. Not that we are not competent in many ways, but this is very challenging. Do you think this is something that we could incorporate or ask NIST to take a first swipe at if we were to give them a general framework to kind of work out some of the kinks on the front end and then maybe make it easier to go through the various committee jurisdictions?
I would make two observations. One, there are actually quite a few bills out there, both on the Republican and Democratic side, that I think are credible efforts or sort of move us down this road. I think it's quite possible that what legislation should do is to set forth basic duties and principles and then ask, whether it's NIST or the FTC or some other regulatory agency to try to fill those out and also, therefore, also be a little bit more nimble in sort of responding to new developments, as you noted earlier. But I think there are some credible efforts that are already out there in terms of bills.
Do you think a joint select committee would facilitate increase the likelihood of success of such an endeavor?
I leave that to you to some degree. I mean, I think the Commerce Committee in the Senate and then E&C here in the House have, as I understand it, been taking the lead to the extent there's been activity around this. Whether that's sufficient jurisdictionally, I'm not enough of an expert in congressional committee jurisdiction to be able to answer that.
I have a feeling that the chairwoman of this committee might want to have a piece of the conversation in here, but the same can probably be said for a number of other committees, and that's the biggest challenge that we have. Would you agree that GDPR and CCPA have perhaps gone a little bit too far in certain regards, and Congress should be careful not to take an overly burdensome approach and perhaps try to facilitate some free market solutions for enforcement mechanisms? I think one of the biggest challenges is growing government and creating standards when we're really just trying to facilitate best practices. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not sure if I would characterize it necessarily as them going too far so much as I would say that we need to move in a slightly different direction, which is that there's a lot of existing privacy laws focus on the idea of notice and then give consent on the part of consumers. And as I talked about in my testimony, I mean, we all know that most consumers never read those 30-page privacy policies. And so I think a privacy law that's based on the assumption that people are going to do that just doesn't really make sense and doesn't match with the real world. And so what I do think we need to do is move more to a system in which we say, hey, there's some basic rules that if you're going to collect personal data, you've got to follow. You've got to minimize the data that you're going to collect. You shouldn't be sharing it in ways that are going to surprise consumers unless you go back and get permission, express permission from the consumers. And you put those kinds of rules in place so that you can't bury in the privacy policy somewhere, hey, we're going to share this with these 10 parties. And then, so I think what we need to do is move in that direction, which I think is less about is GDPR going too far or too less, but so much as sort of shifting the paradigm a little bit.
Sure. I guess last question. U.S. economy is important, but the global economy also has an important role to play. What do you think about Congress trying to extend these protections to people abroad?
I mean, we clearly have to pay attention to what's going on abroad because most of our big companies obviously operate in multiple markets, and as a practical matter, it's very difficult for a large company to do different things based on different geographies. That's why you see, for example, that a lot of companies follow GDPR sort of across the world because it's just easier, having implemented it, it's just easier for them to do that. So I think, if it's going to be hard for Congress to pass a privacy law, I think it's probably hard to negotiate a worldwide privacy law. But having said that, I think paying attention and trying to figure out how what we pass works and meshes with laws in other countries is an important piece of this.
Thank you for your time. Yield back.
Gentlemen's time has expired. Mr. Jain, one of the things we used to call the contracts you're talking about, we called them adhesion contracts, where the consumer really doesn't have much choice and has to adhere to whatever it was that the other contracting party was demanding. And here, people haven't even read the contract, much less have much say as to how it's drafted. I will yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York City for the last questioning, and just want to thank the panel for allowing us to take extra time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. According to a report from Trend Micro, in the first half of 2021, there has been a 1,318% increase in ransomware attacks against banks and credit unions. According to suspicious activity report data from FinCEN, in the first half of 2021, the ransom amount paid out was $590 million compared to only $416 million in all of 2020. This question is for Mr. James. Mr. James, the internet has been around for a while, cryptocurrency has been around for a while. What is driving this inexplicable explosion of ransomware, particularly against financial institutions?
I think that it was mentioned earlier, Mr. Torres, that these bad actors are going where they find the money, and they're going to they're attacking what they think is vulnerabilities in our overall system. And so they're going to attack those institutions that they perceive as vulnerable, and they're going to attack those systems that they perceive as vulnerable, particularly those that have the ability to pay. And so our institutions, community banks, minority depository institutions in particular, are being extremely vigilant about protecting our systems from these kinds of attacks. Not only in terms of the amounts of money that we pay our core processors. At our institution, it's about $25,000 a month, but then all of the additional investments that we're making in training and people and consulting and infrastructure to try to keep up with the rapid rate of change and the rapid increase in these attacks.
And do we know if the ransom payments are primarily coming from small banks, big banks? Do we know the distribution?
I think it's primarily coming from larger institutions than certainly many of our members, but our members are being very, very vigilant and keeping aware of these situations. Most of our institutions are carrying cyber insurance contracts, cyber insurance policies. that would help to mitigate the cost. But the cost and the premiums of those contracts is also, it's increasing exponentially. And so we really need to be mindful of that cost as well as we face additional attacks in the ransomware space.
It seems to me that the greatest challenge to cybersecurity, one of the greatest challenges to cybersecurity, is a lack of enforcement. Right? Almost all crimes on cyberspace go unpunished, with less than 1% resulting in enforcement actions. According to Third Way, for every 1,000 cyber crimes, only 3 of them will actually result in arrest. And so criminals are rational actors. And if the risks are low and the rewards are high, then cyber criminals have an incentive to commit cyber crimes in greater and greater numbers at a faster and faster pace, at a greater and greater scale. And the data is crystal clear that cybercrime is on an exponential curve. According to Cybersecurity Ventures, the cost of cybercrime will go from $3 billion in 2015 to a projected $6 billion in 2021 to a projected $10.5 trillion in 2025. So I'm concerned about the trajectory of cybercrime, particularly as it relates to financial institutions. Mr. Jain, I have a question about Section 1033. I'm a strong supporter of Section 1033, but there are some legitimate concerns about cybersecurity and legitimate concerns about data aggregators, which tend to be largely unregulated and unsupervised. How would you assess the state of cybersecurity with respect to data aggregators?
Sorry, I think there are some real issues there. I think, in particular, I think what we've seen early on in the industry was the use of basically a technique called screen scraping, where essentially a consumer was turning over their credentials to the data aggregator, and the aggregator was scraping the information from the screen. And that clearly presented all sorts of security issues. I think we're starting to move toward a system in which the data aggregators are communicating with financial institutions through APIs or sort of interfaces designed for that, which I think is a positive step. But nonetheless, data aggregators in general don't fall within the purview, for example, of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which sets sort of the privacy and security standards for other actors in the financial system. And so I think it is important to impose privacy and security regulations on entities like data aggregators, ideally through, as we've been talking about, broad baseline privacy legislation, but short of that, then maybe bringing them within Gramm-Leach-Bliley, at least as a transitional measure.
Absolutely. Thank you for the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank our panel for your expert testimony today. Really do appreciate it for giving us a little extra time. Obviously, this is a hot topic for all of us, one that we really need to try to get our arms around. I think, as the chairwoman said, as Mr. Luetkemeyer said, this is one where there is a lot of common desire to minimize the attacks that we all face in the financial industry and elsewhere by cyber criminals and by nation states and other bad actors. So thank you all very much for your testimony today. I want to thank Mr. Thornton for always putting these hybrid hearings together. It's not easy to have somebody in person and a number of folks on the platform, and it worked very well today. I want to thank you for that, sir. And without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And I ask you all to please respond as promptly as you are able. And without objection, statements will be entered into the record on behalf of the following organizations: the National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions, NAFCU, the Electronic Transactions Association, the American Bankers Association, and the Credit Union National Association. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. And with that, thank you all very much. This hearing is adjourned.